Welcome to the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. I am John Razian, director of the institution that was founded in 1919 by Herbert Hoover, a member of Stanford University's first graduating class. Mr. Hoover, the 31st President of the United States, was in charge of international relief efforts in war-torn Europe and Russia at the end of World War I. As part of this undertaking, he extensively documented the causes and consequences of war, generously contributing both archival materials and financial support. He founded the Hoover Institution and dedicated it to collecting scholarly materials pertaining to social changes in the world that would promote peace and avoid war. The collections of the Hoover Institution are dedicated to assisting researchers in their analyses of social, political, and economic change during the 20th century. Our collections number 1.6 million volumes and 40 million archival documents that take up 25 miles of shelving on our premises. The institution dedicates another large portion of its efforts to the advanced study of economic, political, and social changes in both domestic and international affairs. Our goal at Hoover is not only to understand and analyze the causes of such changes, but to address the consequences that public policy has on the dynamics of change. We take pride in our intellectual vitality, interacting first-rate scholarship, and sound proposals for public policy, converting conceptual insights into practical policy initiatives. More than 60 fellows are resident at Hoover, and at any point in time, we have at least half that many visiting scholars. We are economists, political scientists, historians, sociologists, and legal scholars interested in international and domestic economic well-being, the role and impact of political institutions in society, peace and international security, and social philosophy. Today, we proudly welcome you to a program entitled Out of the Red, Economic Transition in Central and Eastern Europe. Scholars everywhere are eager to explore how the dynamics of economic and political institutions change as they move away from communism. We have invited senior government officials from 6 European countries: Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. These officials have met for the past 2 days with scholars from the Hoover Institution and Stanford University. The format of our program allows our international guests to focus on their important goals and achievements to date, and to provide our American specialists with information on the difficulties of achieving economic reform and overcoming the associated constraints. The American and European specialists will lend insight into problems associated with privatization, currency convertibility, and economic reform, and we hope contribute to the ongoing search for solutions. During the next 2 hours, we will reflect on the dialogue and activities of the past 2 days and move the discussions forward. We hope this conference stimulates your thinking about the challenges of the economic transition in Central and Eastern Europe.
for Out of the Red, Economic Transition in Central and Eastern Europe. We are joining you today from the Stauffer Auditorium of the Hoover Institution on the campus of Stanford University. And this 2-hour video conference is the culmination and a continuation of a 2-day conference of top economists and government policymakers. The Hoover Institution convened this conference to discuss the current situation in Central and Eastern Europe and to bring the force of these special economic intellects to bear on the directions Central and Eastern European countries can take to further their economic reform. Now, many of these experts will serve as distinguished panelists during the video conference. The Americans include 2 Nobel laureates in economics and a former Secretary of State. The Europeans are all senior government officials from Central and Eastern Europe, and they will speak as insiders responsible for helping to shape current policy for their countries. And the other attendees of this conference form a most prestigious studio audience, and they will be active participants in today's discussion as well. Also, across the United States, Canada, and Mexico today, at universities, businesses, community centers, and professional offices, there are over 100 sites are connected to today's conference by satellite. And questions and comments from all of these locations will also play key roles in today's dialogue. Now, please note the toll-free telephone number and a fax number now so that you will be able to ask your questions and make your comments later during the conference. The telephone number is 1-800-726-4646. Once again, the telephone number is 1-800-726-4646. And there you see the fax number as well. That is 415-723-1687. Again, the fax number 415-723-1687. And you might also be interested in knowing that this video conference is being carried by satellite via WorldNet to all of the 6 Central and Eastern European countries under discussion today and to many other parts of the world as well. Well, now, it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished American panelists. First, Mr. Milton Friedman, Nobel laureate in economics and best known for his free market economics. Mr. Friedman's name is closely associated with the Chicago School of Economics, where he spent much of his career, and with the Hoover Institution, where he now serves as a fellow. Next, Mr. George Shultz, former Secretary of State under President Ronald Reagan. Mr. Shultz, in fact, has held 4 cabinet appointments over his lifetime. He also was the president of a major American firm and dean of Chicago Business School. An economist, Mr. Shultz is currently a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution. And third is Mr. George Stigler, also a Nobel laureate in economics. Mr. Stigler is responsible for much of the modern literature on industrial structure. He is perhaps best known for much of for his work on regulation of industry and for his studies on market pricing. In addition, because of his authorship of many papers on microeconomics, Mr. Stigler is also responsible for much of what is called the Chicago School of Economics. Currently, he is emeritus professor at Chicago and a fellow of the Hoover Institution. Now, assisting me as moderator today is Mr. Edward Lazier, a fellow at the Hoover Institution and professor of economics at the University of Chicago's Business School. Mr. Lazier was in charge of planning today's conference and has put together a program based on his breadth of scholarship in this arena and his depth of personal knowledge about the challenges facing Central and Eastern Europe. During the past several months, Mr. Lazier has traveled often in that part of the globe and has served as economic advisor to the governments of Romania, Czechoslovakia, and the Russian Republic. And on Wednesday, Mr. Lazier opened this conference. Part of his address set the stage for this video conference so well that we want to share the following pre-taped segment to give you an overview of our work here today.
The creation of economic policy in Central and Eastern Europe has evolved rapidly. When my colleagues and I first met with the ministers of the newly formed governments, their basic decisions were over ideology and timing. Should reform proceed quickly, moving rapidly and simultaneously on all fronts, or should it proceed slowly, exercising caution along the way? In the beginning, over a year ago, most ministers favored caution. Over time, the view has shifted. A metaphor frequently used now is that it is better to cut off a dog's tail in one shot than to do so a little at a time. There are a number of ministers at this conference who have opted to move quickly in order to spare the dog its pain. And we're all still hoping that the animal will survive the procedure. But there are still some discussions over big questions. Most of these deal with the sequencing of reform moves. By now, there's a substantial list of steps that most ministers and economists believe are necessary and desirable in moving toward a market economy. Let me mention the most important of these, for they form the basis of the discussion for this program. First is the liberalization of prices to market levels. Currently, prices that deviate from world levels are causing major distortion and adverse incentives throughout most of Central and Eastern Europe. At the same time, a program for monetary stability must be devised so that very high levels of inflation do not become a dominant feature of the economic landscape. Second is the rapid privatization of state capital. Although all 6 countries under discussion subscribe to this concept, there's a large gap between desire and practice. Third is the transfer of ownership of agricultural land to individuals or small companies. Most Central and Eastern European countries have already begun this transfer. The experience of Poland and China, among others, provides evidence for dramatic changes that can occur when state ownership of agriculture is eliminated or reduced. Fourth is the reorganization of industry currently structured as monopoly or near monopoly. Competition, either foreign or domestic, is needed to ensure that producers behave efficiently and do not restrict output to get higher prices. Fifth is the establishment of well-defined property rights. Investors are unwilling to put money into enterprises when they believe that there's a significant chance that they will lose the right to the profits from them. Sixth, some method for making the local currency convertible into hard currency must be adopted. There are a large number of possibilities. All have the features that will facilitate trade and investment, but each has its potential difficulties as well. Seventh, necessary for the growth of industry is the development of a private banking system. Most countries have taken significant steps already to separate commercial banking from central banking. However, more remains to be decided and done. Eighth, financial markets need to be established, or existing exchanges need to be induced to list Central and Eastern European firms. This development is likely to happen spontaneously, but the exact choice of the institution and its regulation are subject to debate. Ninth, wage setting must be moved from the state to market control. In a market economy, firms make wage offers and attract workers at a competitive environment. But the states of Central and Eastern Europe, with good reason, have been reluctant to free up wages and allow them to be set by individual enterprises. Currently, managers have no obvious incentives to keep wages down. Making manager compensation and job security depend on profitability of the enterprise is a good place to start. There's some movement on this front, but progress is slow. Finally, it's necessary to provide for social insurance. High levels of unemployment and resulting unrest could threaten the entire economic reform of a country. Without generous unemployment insurance, it will be politically very difficult to lay people off. But there still must be limits to these benefits, so that people have incentives to move back into work. These 10 points are among the most pressing on the very full agenda of economic reform.
Now, today's discussion is going to be outlined into 3 different parts, each addressing one or more of the issues that Mr. Lazier just outlined. The first is going to focus on the interaction between politics and economic reform. And the second will focus on privatization and pricing issues. And the third part will look at international trade and currency reform. Our American panelists will remain constant during each of the 3 segments, and they'll be joined by European experts in each segment. Now, we can't begin a discussion on economic transition without first looking at the realities of the politics and the people. Hope to have a tape here to outline some of the politics and people issues. And there we go. These buildings and halls, once the homes of communist power, are now the centers of new governments for the nations of Central and Eastern Europe. Here they struggle simultaneously with political and economic transition in the dual effort to provide political freedoms and economic prosperity. After decades of authoritarian governments, each of these nations is working now to ensure more personal freedom and individual participation in the political processes of government. But the kind of political reform needed to ensure transition to a market economy and economic prosperity goes well beyond those associated with the individual rights. For example, Central and Eastern European countries have operated for years without an explicit tax code, without laws governing private property, and without any need for corporate governance. Former regulation of wages, health care, unemployment, education and training, and other labor issues are political concerns that must now be handled in a different way. Politics means people. Today, most people in Central and Eastern European countries find the cost of living rising at an alarming rate, while their salaries do not begin to keep pace. They often find long lines, the prerequisite to the basic needs of life. And they also find the basic needs unavailable. The ways the new governments deal with these issues are critical to their abilities to implement even the best long-term plans for economic transition. Mr. Lazier just recently returned from Eastern Europe, and maybe you can start us off here about looking at some of the other political problems that are being faced right now with these countries in economic transition.
There are a number of policies that most economists and government officials in Central and Eastern Europe agree are necessary in order to further the economic reform. But the problem is that many of these reforms are not necessarily politically popular. The reason that politics gets in the way is that economic reforms that are in the good of society are not necessarily to the advantage of each of the individuals in it. And the vested interests will have incentives to scream loudly when policies are undertaken which will affect their interests. Poland, which has undertaken some of the most radical reform and perhaps is furthest along toward its move to a market economy, with the possible exception of Hungary, has certainly had market reforms and has had some progress. But we also note that Tadeusz Mazowiecki, the first leader of Poland, is no longer in office. Likewise, if you look to Russia, recent increases in prices brought strikes by key workers, by the miners and other workers, and price hikes in Romania brought the people to the streets. One major obstacle to reform is the unemployment that might result from undertaking reforms that are good in the long run but have some short-run impacts during the transition period. Governments are cognizant of this, and they've taken steps to alleviate the harm of unemployment by instituting unemployment compensation provisions. But those unemployment compensation provisions can't do everything, and the question will be whether economically sound policies that result in unemployment will be risked by the government because of political reasons.
Well, at this point, I'd like to introduce our European expert here. Mr. Adrian Severin, the Vice Prime Minister of Romania, is joining us today. A lawyer by training, Mr. Severin rose quickly in the post-Ceausescu government. He has acted as Minister of the Economy and has been a major architect of economic reform during the past year. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Severin. And you are in the middle of one of the hottest political situations in Eastern Europe, and you are now a politician. It's not the most enviable position often, and how do you hope to accomplish your economic goals while still recognizing your political constraints?
Well, this is a very good point, but I would like to emphasize an aspect concerning the link between the economic and political reform. Because here I think there are a couple of questions which deserve an answer. Is it political freedom a must, a prerequisite condition for achieving the economic goals, for establishing a prosperous economy? This could be a first question. And the second question, is it economic freedom a warranty for a political freedom, for a real democracy? I think that we have enough examples of non-democratic countries having quite efficient economies. And we have other examples of democratic countries with non-efficient economies. But at this point, I think that we have to make the distinction between authoritarian political regimes and totalitarian political regimes. And, well, if an authoritarian political regime could support an efficient economy, or at least would allow it, a totalitarian regime, and speaking about totalitarian regime, we can think to the communist regime themselves, would never allow an economic policy to be performed, since the golden rule of these totalitarian regimes, of this communist regime, is the complete intervention, 100% presence in any moment of the economic life, of the social life. As far as Romania is concerned, I have to say that the communist dictatorship was one of the most, of the hardest dictatorship. And on the other hand, I have to say that in our revolutions there is a peculiarity. The political system collapsed more or less by night. After the revolution of December 1989, by night we have no political communist structures. And suddenly several political parties appear without any new regulations, without any new laws. Suddenly trade unions appeared, suddenly independent journals, newspapers appeared. And that's why I think that this peculiarity forced us, and I think it's lucky that we were forced, to speed up the economic reform process. Since the two in the former communist countries, the economic reform and the political reform should be linked. They are twinned because any difference, any big difference in time, in pace, would provoke social turmoils, riots. And I think we have an example in Russia of a political reform without enough economic reforms, and another example in China, an economic reform without enough political reforms. And I would add that it is a feature of communist regimes, and anyhow it's a feature of Romania, former communist regime, that they have depolitized the social life. So apparently the most of the valid people were obliged to join the Communist Party and to attend communist meetings and political meetings. But this was not a real political life, because a real political life means freedom as a prerequisite condition. A prerequisite means several political parties, diversity of opinions allowed to be expressed. And on the other hand, it was an economic politicization. The economy was politicized, since all the decisions in economy were taken, have been taken on political reasons. Ideology was more important than economy. Well, this is perhaps one of our very, very difficult tasks, to politicize the society and to depolitize the economy. Of course, freedom, a political freedom, does not mean automatically a strong economy. Political freedoms brings only opportunities, and we have to take the chance of these opportunities through real, wise economic policies in order to reach a higher level of prosperity in our country. And on the other hand, I would say that political freedom will push the government, any government, to depolitize the economy, since the diversity of opinions are pushing us, are determining us, the government, to give freedom to economic agents. Well, this process requires experience, requires know-how, requires good training. I'm afraid we lack all these three in a very high degree. And so I think that these could be three important topics to try to train yourself and to train the people, to try to make this political opening and to try to link these political openings to market freedom with the real market economy. And let me, at the end of my introduction or my comments, to quote, in this context, one of the most famous former American presidents, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who said once that liberty without learning is in peril, and learning without liberty is in vain. We would be able, I think, to add to these sentences other two sentences which I feel to be correct. And I would say political freedom without market economy is in vain, and market economy without political freedom is in peril. And I think that we could be equally right if we are replacing the words market economy with private property. So this is the tasks. These are the tasks
And a
we
difficult
have.
task.
And I think it's a challenging task. And well, speaking about learning and teaching and training, I have nothing to do but to welcome the involvement of HOOVER institution. And I think that this meeting was really enlightening for all of us, I would say for both of us, both parties, in order to, to let us get out from the red. I would say that we are already out from the red. This is not anymore a problem. The problem is to enter a new era of prosperity, a new era of real political freedom.
And I'd like to involve some of our other panelists in the discussion. Mr. Shultz, from your perspective as an economist and your years in the State Department, you have a unique perspective on looking at this balancing act between political reform and economic reform. What comments can you make on this subject?
Well, I liked your laws, and if I can try to state one of them, again, you said that economic reform without political reform is in peril. But I think the question is, which one is in peril? And people often point to Chile as an example of a country that managed to get a lot of economic reform going very successfully, but had a rather repressive political regime. But I think myself that the openness and the freedom of choice that was more and more a part of Chilean life on the economic side infected the political side more than vice versa. So perhaps we could say if you have one without the other, it's not a stable situation. But it isn't foregone as a conclusion which way things are going to tilt. I think these are tough issues. And you recognize how tough they are when you see that what you're doing in your country and in the countries around you is by no means unique. It's a continuing struggle. Here in the United States, we have a kindergarten through high school public educational system that everyone recognizes is in serious trouble. And it's basically a socialized system. And there are efforts to turn that around and change it, and to introduce the notion of choice into that school system. But let me tell you, it ain't easy. And the body politic resists it, and there's a lot of push from the educational bureaucracy to block change. Maybe that sounds familiar to you.
Very familiar.
I only mention it because you see how continuing and pervasive this problem is. You have to keep working at it all of the time. I think the examples you gave of Russia and China were right on the mark. And I remember back in 1988, in the summer, I had a visit with Deng Xiaoping, and I asked him what he thought of Mr. Gorbachev's reforms and what he was doing, and he sort of laughed. And he said, well, Gorbachev has got it all wrong. He's made a lot of changes in the political system, but he hasn't done anything about economics, whereas we Chinese are smarter. We have encouraged some economic reform, and it's basically worked. That means we have support for the economic reform, and at the same time we've managed to keep a strong political hand. Well, as you pointed out, both have blown up in their faces, and for a similar kind of reason of needing to have this intermixture. I reflect back on my own experience in sort of facing this kind of issue. What do you do when you have a problem put to you that you're struggling with, an issue of policy, and you know the right answer is here, and the political forces are very strong, and somebody says to you, instead of doing this, why don't you do this? And it's a bad solution, but it's much better than the solution over here that'll probably be produced if you don't do this. As I reflected back on my experience, the times that I got trapped into that kind of decision were the worst decisions I ever made. And I think somehow as you and others confront these problems, it's best to have a good, clear compass of where you want to be and to keep battling for that point of view rather than to get caught up in compromises that are justified because of the politics. Just as an aside, Ed, you said that Poland introduced sweeping economic reforms, and they did, although they could have been more sweeping, and that the president who introduced them got beaten in an election, with an implication that people couldn't stand up to the reforms. My impression is that the man who beat him was the most popular politician in the history of Poland, on the one hand, and that Lech Walesa was campaigning for a greater degree of reform than had been instituted. So it was an interesting twist in saying to the regime that you went pretty far along, but you didn't go far enough, as distinct from saying, draw back.
Now, when you listen to that, Mr. Severin, he's talking about ideal situations, Mr. Shultz, keeping that clear goal.
No, I'm not talking about ideal situations. I'm talking about all the messy problems you're into when you're a government official in a democratic government, and people legitimately have a right to express themselves, of course, and you have to listen to them, but you're charged with trying to provide the right answer in public policy.
How can you?
And you're just subject to all these pulls and hauls all the time, and it never stops.
And but you're saying he can still compromise, but just keep that goal in view?
I think it's obviously the art of creative compromise, where you keep things moving in the right direction, is the essence of democratic government. But I think from the standpoint of an official, a minister of economy, I had that type of job in the United States at one time. If you don't have a pretty clear compass out there and stick to it, you're going to get in very, very serious trouble.
Well, you are perfectly right. We have to keep in mind our goals and to go as much as possible straight forward to these goals. But we face a very interesting exercise, a direct transition from a dictatorship, most ruthless dictatorship, to a democracy. You know, I think that never in history such an experience has not been tried.
It's so sweeping.
And, yes. And sometimes, you know, during such direct transitions, people are mixing up democracy with anarchy. And when we are facing anarchy, we have sometimes, I'm speaking at least about the Romanian experience, since our transition was quite, a violent one. And when we are facing the anarchy, a government facing an anarchy is tempted, has the temptation to use a little bit another tools than the orthodox democratic tools. And well, I think that we have to believe in democracy nevertheless, and to beat, to overcome these obstacles with democratic means, and not with the means which are not very democratic. On the other side, on the other hand, we need, and I think this is an experience from all the countries in the area, For achieving our goals, our economic goals, we need a powerful government. And this is a contradiction. This is a paradox. You know, a government which is supposed to manage a crisis, it's an unpopular government. An unpopular government, at least in a short run, an unpopular government, it's challenged, and it has to face important contestation. And on the other hand, we need a government which is challenged and which is contested. It's not the most powerful government. And on the other hand, we need a powerful government in order to implement the reforms. This is
power comes from broad support and the legitimacy that that support gives, not just from a strong police force.
Sure, sure.
But I think you have to be careful about the use of words. Talking about the problem of democracy sounds like the problems you face come primarily from the masses of the people. My impression is that that's not true. One of the characteristics of the authoritarian governments that you came from was that it was a class structure with a small group of nomenclatura who were highly favored, who did very well, had high levels of living, and a large masses of exploited population. And my impression is, and you know much better than I and can correct me, that a major part of the problem of moving toward a really free private market, a major obstacle to it is this small nomenclatura. Nobody likes to give up vested positions he's had. And they fight, as I understand it, very hard to try to preserve their own privileges. And I suspect that that's a much more fundamental obstacle to achieving the right kind of reforms than is the resistance from the bulk of the people, the masses of the people.
Well, there are several interesting things here, and it's very frustrating that the time is too short for discussing all of them. But we have to say that, you know, the economic reforms has as the first step the legal reform. We can introduce any economic reforms through a legal way, adopting the acts, the bills, and so on. But this is not enough, obviously, because, you know, the new law, the new economic mechanism comes immediately into contradiction, not only with the old communist bureaucracy, but also with the social structures which are a consequence of the economic policy, the communist economic policy. The forced industrialization, the huge industrial complexes we had, the fact that we didn't pay attention to agriculture, attract or pushed, if you want, a lot of peasants in the towns. These peasants are not anymore these fellows are not anymore peasants, but they are not still workers. They are not skilled enough. They are not used to take the risks. And, you know, a free market means to share the risks as well. And these are also a big obstacle against the reform, because they are not few, and in a short run, for such kind of people, reforms doesn't bring too much good news. They have to be more skilled, they have to work more, they have to share the risks. And, well, I think these are things which are not so easy to be understood by people who are, you know, in that situation.
But the masses benefit as well. After all, it's always seemed to me a mystery. Why, if you take a country like Romania, in which your resources are being used very inefficiently, in which human capital and human people are being used inefficiently, there is no reason why, if you just lift the restrictions on them, output cannot go up more or less immediately in some areas. And that means that there are large groups of people who benefit. The people who are really hurt by this are the politically favored classes who have lost their position. That's why the government officials we see here at this meeting are surprisingly young, because they've come in from outside.
They're unsurprisingly young.
They're unsurprisingly young, right. The old people are all contaminated. They're all part of that nomenclatura, and they're out of the business, fortunately.
But Milton, agreeing with your point about the potential for expansion, wouldn't it be true that if you lift restrictions, the places that are most likely to be responsive are food, clothing, distribution, retailing. These are all essentially possible to do in relatively small enterprises. And at least what I've observed around the world is that people behave instinctively more or less the same way. Absolutely. It was surprising to some in the Soviet Union that when they announced that the prices were going to go up in a couple of months, that people went out and bought everything in sight. But I don't know why that should have been a surprise. People behave that way all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then what role should government play during this process? Any role at all?
Oh, sure, getting out of the way.
How did I know you were going to say that?
But I want to say one more thing in comment on Mr. Severin's comment. You're out of the red politically, but you're in the red economically.
You know,
Red has two different meanings. One is a political meaning and one is an economic meaning, a balance sheet meaning. And one of the major problems is that all of these countries are in the red. Or I shouldn't say all of them. Czechoslovakia and Poland have done rather well in that respect, but they have a great problem of keeping out of the red.
Done too badly.
I wouldn't agree, or I would agree with you up to a certain extent. We are in the red, and I think this is a problem for all the countries in the area, since we cannot change the structures, the existing economic structures, by night. We have to build up. We have to give freedom, and we did it. We made it. But anyhow, the old structures come into contradiction, come in opposition with the new regulations, with the old economic structures. That's why it is necessary to proceed very fast and very quickly to an economic restructuring, but this economic restructuring should take place as a result of a market incentives and to be held by the government. Well, I think that one of our important principles is that the government should go away from the economy. The old, system, which has the government or the state, the only one owner and the only one manager of the economy is practically ceased in Romania. The problem is that the old structures exist, and lacking experience, lacking an entrepreneurial spirit, lacking what we are calling a middle class, lacking private capital. That's why we have chosen the voucher system for privatization. All this keep us a little bit in the red. In this respect, you are right, but we are forcibly to stay.
I think there's more to it than getting out of the way.
Oh, there is, much more.
Thank you.
There are good ways to get out of the red and bad ways to get out of the red. And in some
And we're going to have to go into that in our next segment, because right now we're going to end this particular discussion on politics and economies and move on to our second segment, which is going to be focusing on pricing and privatization. Now, the following videotape provided by KPIX in San Francisco illustrates a small example of the concerns that come with privatization in today's Poland.
Music from the 70s coming out of a radio from the 50s in a shop where workers use machinery from the 40s. Welcome to Poland in the 90s. This is Andrzej Białos's pocketbook factory, or part of it, north of Warsaw. The rest of the operation is here in a converted chicken coop a few miles away. It's his private company. Mr. Białos is a capitalist.
During martial law in 1981, I was simply fired from work. I had the choice to either leave for the West with my family or try something on my own. Most of my friends went west. I went into my basement and started to tinker with something.
Tinkerers like Białos are one of the keys to the new Poland's economic survival. He employs 24 people. Each makes about $100 a month, roughly 3 times the national average. It's a tight, efficient operation out to make a profit, a 6-letter word that would have made the old communist government blanch. He expects to produce over $200,000 worth of exports this year, most of it going to the Ukraine and, of all places, Azerbaijan. Seems they have a weakness there for plastic pocketbooks covered with pictures cut out of old West German fashion magazines. But Andrzej Białos is a frustrated guy. It's tough enough to do business in a country where a phone call can take up to an hour to go through, across town, let alone run into the one thing the communists did well in Poland, build a bureaucracy.
Small businesses like mine are in a very difficult situation. I can't get credit. the government won't extend it, and there are a whole host of regulations and laws and paperwork I have to deal with. We must install new machinery to become more efficient, but to buy such machines, I must have money.
When they go to Warsaw and they have to pay 65 up to $165 and you offer $19.95, you will have a full house. In 3 months or 6 months, you will go to $30.
The fellow giving the lesson in good old all-American price raising is Andrew Wushai of Monterey, California, a retired Polish-American businessman. Here, trying to help the folks who run this place, a newly renovated castle turned hotel 40 miles out of Warsaw. 70 rooms, all empty. It used to be owned by the state, but since the change in government, no one is quite sure who is in charge. So while the staff comes to work every day, they're not advertising, so no one comes here to stay. Poland, traveling down the road to a free economy, but in desperate need of a new set of wheels. Outside Warsaw, Poland, Mike Hegedus, Channel 5, Eyewitness News.
And there is a long road ahead, and you just watched, Mr. Lazier, that tape that showed some of the problems facing small entrepreneurs. What are some of the other problems with privatizing state capital, and how does that work with pricing policies?
You know, privatization has become one of the cliches of the reform. It seems to be the rallying cry in all countries, and everybody agrees now that capital needs to be moved from state hands into private hands. There's no one that really disputes that. The question is, how is that going to be brought about? And there are really two paths that people see for getting the capital into the hands of private individuals. The first path is to privatize the state capital directly and to go aggressively to make sure that state capital is turned over to private individuals. The second path is simply to play down the capital that's in state hands and hope that capital will form, newly formed capital will be in private hands, and that will simply replace state capital. But there have been a number of approaches to privatization that the Eastern and Central European countries have been thinking about. For the most part, in terms of privatizing small-scale companies, what the governments have done is held auctions and simply auctioned off the capital, and that's gone quite well. The larger scale enterprises have presented a bit more of a problem. The most favored scheme there involves some kind of a voucher system where generally individuals in society would be given coupons, stock certificates to the enterprises, and they would be able to trade these certificates either to the enterprises themselves or to larger holding companies. While everybody accepts that privatization is going to be an important step, deciding the details of the privatization procedure has actually taken a tremendous amount of time. One example, probably the best example, is from Czechoslovakia, where arguments over the restitution of capital to historical owners took a couple of months and delayed the privatization while people argued about who would get the capital that used to belong to them. A major problem is that privatization without demonopolization may not help very much. Even if you have private capital, if you maintain the existing monopolies that currently exist in the current societies, prices are going to be high, firms are going to have incentives to restrict output and distort the process, and that will result in inefficiency. Despite the problems created by continuing to support prices, governments have taken some steps toward freeing prices, but there are some that they've been quite resistant on. Prices of energy, input prices, and labor. In particular, governments have been very reluctant to free those up. I should note, by the way, that the unwillingness to free all prices is not specific to Central and Eastern Europe. It's a theme that we see certainly in Western Europe and also in the United States.
Well, at this point, I'd like to introduce the two experts joining us for this part of the discussion, Mr. OGNIAN and Mr. Stanislav Velic. Excuse me, sir. Mr. Pishev is the Bulgarian ambassador to the United States, and he has held his post in Washington, D.C. since December. And before that, he was an academic economist and a member of the opposition. Mr. PISHEY has been an outspoken advocate of economic reform for some time, and in addition to his duties as ambassador, he is an economic advisor to the President of Bulgaria. Mr. Velic is economic advisor to Poland, a Pole by birth, and he has spent most of his adult life as an academic economist in several countries. Currently, he is a professor on leave from Columbia University, and during the past year, he returned to his native Poland to assist the government in formulating the economic reform program. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. And let me begin with you, Mr. PISHEY, if I may. There is considerable disagreement over how much privatization and price liberalization should occur. In your opinion, what is the best time frame for implementing these?
Well, it's not easy to give the exact timing and the sequencing of the reform process. Some time ago, the Czechoslovak finance minister said that it is like a chess game. So you can't read the chess opening because those books haven't been written yet. So we should know the rules of the game and try to plan 2 or 3 moves ahead. There were several issues that are confused when one speaks of privatization. At least there are 3 currents that lead to the re-emergence of a private economy in a collectivized society. The first one is the dismantling of big public enterprises, and this is the most visible part of the whole story. But the second is the privatization of small and medium businesses, and the third, which is for me the most important, is the spontaneous emergence of new private businesses. So we're obsessed by the ideas how to privatize white elephants, and this reminds me of a joke when the ants decided to attack the elephant. They climbed on its back, but it just shook them off, and there was one ant left on top, and the others began shouting, "Strangle it, strangle it." And the ant said, "I can't, it is constantly slipping through my fingers." So the Berlin Wall came down, but you can't use the concrete that had been poured to build it.
You can sell it.
No.
Yes, they did.
Well, the number of American tourists visiting Eastern Europe is rather limited, so the market is not big enough even for the rubble. But the issue is that we are trying to devise the perfect intellectual scheme and impose it on a society that is alive, that is active, full of emotion, political hope and desires. And that's why I think this is a mistaken approach, to devise the perfect scheme and impose it on this society. This reminds me of the way socialism was constructed in our countries. And now, when I speak of timing, I remember a famous saying of one of our Communist Party leaders. He said after the war that in 10 to 15 years we have to build all what the other countries built in 100 years. So I don't want to repeat the same mistake. And to return to the ends, they're far more efficient when it comes to dismantling a monolithic structure. And this is maybe the most important issue in our societies because, I would like to say something about it, the physical reality is different. I tend to disagree with Professor Friedman that our economies will be able to reply instantaneously to price signals, to changes in the environment. And I'll give you a couple of very simple examples. People in our countries live in huge blocks of flats of prefabricated concrete. And when you increase prices of fuel, the obvious response will be to limit consumption or make a more efficient use of energy. But when the heating is centralized, individual people cannot respond to this market signal. They simply suffer. A second example. You want to create a market which isn't there even physically. You want to move goods from one place to another. You don't have gasoline, and that was obvious from the Polish example. So these are simple things, physical constraints, and you can avoid the reality. So it will take time. And I'm absolutely in complete agreement with Professor Friedman that the best role government should play is to get out of the way. But even in our country, they coined the term a kamikaze government, a government that will start the reform and perish, because it's a conscientious effort to dismantle a completely centralized system. I don't think that we'll be able to devise one single centralized approach to privatization, as I mentioned in the beginning. And that's why ideas like vouchers and distribution of coupons do not appeal to me. It's an essentially macro-political or macroeconomic attempt to give an answer to an essentially microeconomic issue. And when it comes to private property rights, I would add another notion which is very important for me, and this is a notion we inherit from classical political economy, that is of division of labor. The industrial organization in our countries has definite physical characteristics. The predominance of big enterprises was directly related to the political system, but this led to a physical embodiment of this industrial organization, so it will take time to dismantle.
Well, you mentioned the Poland example, and I think that's a perfect time for Mr. Village to talk to us. And what does the Polish experience tell us about economic reform?
Well, the Polish experience, first of all, pricing. As you probably know, most prices were freed on January 1st, 1990. The only remaining administered prices are rents, housing rents, and energy and transport. Housing rents, as those of you who lived in New York know, are very difficult to remove. They have been raised gradually. I think probably it would have been better to raise them immediately, but late in 1989, nobody really knew what the patience of the public would be. There was a fear that if there was too much of an earthquake, people would turn right against the government, which they did not. They gave a tremendous amount of support to the government. So in retrospect, probably rents could have been raised right then, even though from an administrative point of view, it was extremely difficult because there's factory housing, private housing, public housing, cooperative housing, and so on. It's an absolute administrative maze. But other than that, prices were raised very radically. For instance, price of coal was multiplied by a factor of 5, and by now, most prices, including price of coal, are on international levels. So the price reform, by and large, was a great success. Fuel also is on an international level now. Privatization is a much more difficult issue. Small-scale privatization is going very quickly. Basically, the local property belongs now or is administered by local authorities. They are auctioning off leases on stores. About 70% of all retail outlets now are private. Much of wholesale trade is in private hands. In recent weeks, newspapers have been auctioned off. So this is going very quickly and very smoothly with very visible results. Stores are still not up to Western standards, but they are enormously better. I mean, anybody walks through a street in Poland can see a visible difference. The large-scale privatization presents a number of problems. Probably the biggest problem is the lack of resources. There are very few private resources in a country which was under communist rule for 40-odd years. Most of the capital is in government hands or in public hands, not in government. And moreover, such institutions as mortgage banking do not exist. Not only mortgage banking doesn't exist, but as was mentioned several times, including Mr. Azir mentioned it, property rights are very ill-defined, and therefore it's very difficult to have a mortgage on property nobody knows who it belongs to. So that the possibility of selling off larger scale property is very difficult because of lack of private resources. And then there's also a problem valuation. Even in a country like Britain, where there was a very well-developed market, valuation of industrial property turned out to be very difficult indeed. In Poland, it's really a total nightmare. Properties are being valued, some enterprises are being valued by important Western banks like Warburg or JP Morgan. They are, after months and months and months of study, they are unwilling even to sign a statement saying how much the stuff is what they should be valued at. It's a sheer guesswork. So on one hand, it's difficult to say how much it is worth. On the other hand, it's a question of who is going to purchase it. So we're now we're continuing this method of selling property off. There are several means of doing it. Some it's sort of insider sales, which might not be a very good idea, but at least go very quickly. Technically speaking, medium-sized enterprises are liquidated and sold to new enterprises in which the former employees are shareholders. Various such devices exist, and a new scheme is being worked out where we hope to attract financial intermediaries, basically investment bankers, who will either for free or almost for free be given control of enterprises to turn them around, and once they turn them around, then they'll sell the shares, they'll go public.
It's an interesting approach.
And this is, I just want to say one more word. We're not trying to say what those intermediaries should be like. We'd like to have a proper setting for them so they can be attracted.
All right. Well, pricing and privatization is an area of expertise for Mr. Stigler, and I think, Mr. Stigler, maybe you can comment first on this.
I'll be glad to. It seems to me that this session, like the first one, is dominated by the pervasive ties between the political and the economic system. I think those ties are modern ties, not ancient ties. The traditional view of democracy was a system of well-vested private rights, of a government of laws, not of men, with full civil and political rights for individuals, but essentially devoid of important economic content. And so that a private enterprise system and classical systems could have a wide range of free economic behavior by individuals. And there was no large presumption of egalitarianism. That element of egalitarianism is now deeply embedded in the democratic view. And so much of the modern press in America, for example, thinks that if we're discussing something like national health, that we're really discussing a fundamental political right of citizens rather than an economic income redistribution policy that may or may not be engaged in. And I think it's a serious problem that we now put fairness almost as high as efficiency. That's okay in a very rich society like ours, because while fairness is at least as expensive as lunch, and we all know that they're not free, I don't think we pay proper account of what fairness can cost. Fairness can lead to pay structures which are distort incentive systems and make it very hard for people to be allocated to the right occupations. Fairness often involves greatly detailed procedural steps so that everybody gets their right hearing, and which are very inefficient. Now, nobody, I think, is so malicious as to say that they want to produce injustice in the system, but I wish we could play down this fairness rule, and I say for the sake of the poor, not against them. In the long run, the welfare of the poor and the rich in Eastern Europe is not going to depend upon how they squabble over and divide the very small pie they have now. It's going to depend on how fast they grow. And we have in the United States the richest poor in the world. If you compare our poor with all other poor, we've just done a splendid job of enriching the poor. That has come almost exclusively from 2 centuries of marvelous economic growth and very little from an apparatus of welfare payments and the like. And so I would argue for submerging in the short run fairness considerations for efficiency considerations. I find it very hard as an American to tell a European how to privatize, and in fact I almost wish they'd tell me. Let me give you a contemporary example of why I think that problem is serious. One of the industries that we run in America is a large number of plants in different communities, the sole purpose of which is to give employment to the people in that community. They are called Army and Navy bases. Now, for many, many years, we've tried to abolish them. Some, for example, have lost their primary function as the Indians in the area have been disarmed or at least given up their bows and arrows. There's no real progress. At the present time, we have an extremely intricate system which we're trying to make work, in which all kinds of panels review it, and the Congress gets to vote yes or no, but dare not vote yes on this one base or this one base over here. That shows you how deeply embedded the special interests are in an economic system, whether it's primarily capitalistic or, as we're told commonly in this Eastern European context, is a nomenclatura or something of that sort. And so that's why I don't see any fundamental reform than to again resell the advantages of a private enterprise system, to do a large amount of educating, which we have to do as much at home as we have to do over there, in how generous, even to the poor, a relatively free economic system may be.
Well, Mr. Friedman, I want to give you a chance also to respond. Mr. Pishev said that what happens when the economy won't respond quickly, and he believes it won't.
The question of going from 10% to 20% is different from going from 10% to 100%. And 10% to 20% is a doubling. That doesn't involve a quick response. It doesn't involve an extensive response. There will be a response, and the response will be in the right direction. Obviously, it will take time. But I think there are two other issues that I would like to comment on with respect to what Stan Willis said in particular, but also with what Mr. Pishev said. One element of privatization that hasn't been discussed is removing obstacles to the establishment of new enterprises which didn't exist before. And in some of these Eastern European countries, existing state monopolies are in existence, in which it is illegal for private individuals to go into competition with them. In the second place, the most effective way to privatize a highly inefficient government enterprises is through international competition or free trade. And you should not leave out freeing trade barriers as really a device for privatization. In the third place, you do have some white elephants. I have been saying that you should talk about those enterprises that should be privatized and those that should be bulldozed. No one in his right mind would conceivably attach any positive value to Nowa Huta, which is a big steel plant in Poland, which produces an incredible, unbelievable amount of pollution at very high cost. It's the highest cost pollution in the world. But so far as those that have assets, I disagree sharply with Stan's comment that there is no private resources. I ask him, who owns those enterprises? He'll tell me the government, the state. Who's the state? It's the people. The people own those enterprises. And if those enterprises are worth anything, the people have private resources. And the right answer is to give them to the people. I think it's a great mistake to try to sell off those enterprises. I think you should give them to the people. That's the whole purpose of the kind of voucher scheme that Mr. Václav Klaus has been trying to develop in Czechoslovakia, and that I think has been being developed in Romania, Hungary, and other countries. And it seems to me that that's the only really feasible and practical approach. You cannot get... It seems to me it is far more important to privatize them than how you privatize them. You've got to do it, you have to do it fast, and you'll never do it fast if you try to take the Britain privatization as your model.
May I respond? First of all, just a question to George Stigler, which I don't expect him to answer. I'd like to find out what he means, what means of unjust but efficient way he'll propose, because we certainly be very glad to hear it. About Milton Friedman's comment.
I was under the impression that there was already considerable hostility to personal wealth in any substantial quantity in these Eastern economies. That's regrettable.
No, in Poland less than elsewhere, I think.
Well, that just leaves the question open about elsewhere. That Poland sins no more than others does not make it a saint.
But more seriously, the monopolies in Poland, which are left, are two, the post office and the railroad, and I think that nobody in his sane mind would try to compete with either. Everywhere else, private enterprise.
In the United States, UPS.
You can start a UPS in Poland. In fact, there's already DHL and whatever it is, the Express. There are a few things, but you cannot start your own railroad. But I don't think you'd want to. Everything else, you're welcome to start on free enterprise. In terms of distribution of property, I mentioned that we're trying to to provide a framework for investment banks, venture capitalists of various kinds to pick up virtually for free or for free the various enterprises and try to restructure them. The shares on those enterprises, on those intermediaries, are supposed to be distributed widely to the public. The reason why one doesn't give each man a piece of share in Nova Huta is that it turns out that the cost of wide distribution of shares, no matter how you do it, is absolutely prohibitive. The other problem is that if you do that, you're going to have widespread ownership with very little concentration of control, and one of the chief reasons for inefficiency in Poland is lack of control. It's not that the government mismanages it. Nobody controls the enterprises. And what we like to do is to have management which is under sufficient control, has sufficient incentive to restructure and to junk the stuff which is no good and to do something positive with stuff which is good. And this is what we're working on.
Of a private investor from another country.
Excuse me?
What about the role of a private investor from another country?
Oh, they're very welcome.
And they bring a lot. They bring access to international markets. They bring expertise.
The first wave of private entrepreneurs who come to our countries are not the most promising ones quite often. And I remember something that was said to me by a Belgian. He likened those entrepreneurs to Belgians who go to Thailand to get married because they cannot find a wife in Belgium. So it's, it's not a very healthy development. But I would like to argue with...
I don't think that's a very good analogy. You know your own country much better than I do, but I have the impression, for instance, in Hungary, some of the outstanding and most successful companies in the United States have made investments there. So they've attracted good companies, and the fact that a private investor tries to find the most profitable possibility shouldn't be surprising. It's a way of sorting out what will work and what won't work.
But George, I think you have to be careful to distinguish two issues. One is you should certainly attract foreign capital in the sense of placing no obstacles before, and in the sense of allowing them to come in on the same conditions on which you would any domestic person. But I believe it would be a very great mistake for these countries to make special, to extend special privileges or special rights to foreign companies in order to attract them. That gets into a political issue as well as an economic issue. From a short-run economic point of view, that might make sense. But politically, it will end up having the government saddled with the charge that it sold off the crown jewels for bargain basement prices.
You're back to fairness. Milton,
no, that isn't a question of fairness. This is a question of political stability.
I never thought I'd hear Milton so socialistic.
That's right. He's converted. But
I don't believe that's socialistic. I believe that's very realistic.
I think that America...
I will tell you one more thing.
I'll settle for one.
One more. Any one of these schemes which involves special privileges also involves governmental corruption.
Special privileges is not... If you say, here is something that will sell you, and we say to you that for the first 3 years you're operating, the tax rates will be X, whereas otherwise they might be Y. That's a way of giving an incentive that's out in the open and perfectly understandable. And it operates everywhere.
For a company that can make a rational choice to find a good, profitable investment in that country. And if there is such, they come up with no incentives.
Let's not be too romantic. Anybody who makes a long-term investment in one of these Eastern European countries now is taking a real chance. 5 years from now, Welch may be back in a humble position of a Columbia professor. Michelle may be earning a living elsewhere. How do we know what the long-run prospects and stability of the environment is?
I'd like to open this up right now to a caller who is calling in from California, I believe. Caller, could you go ahead and please address your comments to whoever?
Yes, this is a question from Nicholas Atco of the World Trade Center Association. The question is, despite Romania's liberal policy investment and the lowest foreign debt in Eastern Europe, which should make Romania an attractive place to invest. Why are we not getting more information on Romania compared to the other countries of Eastern Europe?
Would anyone like to attempt to answer that?
We ought to get back to the Romanian.
I know we have Mr. Severin in our audience,
Very
and
much.
Mr. Severin, could you perhaps answer that question?
Well, the answer is very simple. Unfortunately, this is the weakest point of our policy in Romania. We do not know how to sell our image abroad. I hope that in the future we will be better and will inform more about what we are doing. Perhaps because we have started this process a little bit later than the others, we have concentrated ourselves to the substantial points and we have ignored, and this is not well at all, good at all, the problem of public relations and public image. I hope that in the future the interested business people from United States will have more information about Romania.
Thank you, Mr. Severin. Pricing and privatization issues deserve a lot more attention and a lot more discussion, but I'm afraid because of our time constraints, we're going to need to move on to our third area. And in this next segment, we are going to concentrate on the importance of financial markets and currency convertibility. Both are vital if these countries hope to attract foreign investors. Eastern European countries all see foreign investment as an important way to improve their economic stability and prosperity. They are eager to attract both large corporations and small entrepreneurial co-ventures. These nations offer an array of important assets that should attract foreign capital. For example, within Central and Eastern Europe, are millions of potential consumers eager for goods of almost every sort. The lands are fertile with fields of grain, orchards, vineyards, forests, and grazing lands. A variety of natural resources abound: oil, coal, natural gas, and hydroelectrical energy. And many of these are still largely undeveloped. The labor force, though undertrained for managerial and technical jobs, is plentiful, eager to learn, and willing to work cheaply. And in every country, in varying degrees, political and economic reforms are underway. At the same time, there are serious detriments to foreign investment. Most important, perhaps, is that most of the nations of Central and Eastern Europe do not have full convertibility of currency, and they have not yet established private capital markets. There are no organized stock exchanges in any single country, or for the Central and Eastern European region. Despite the strong potential for economic growth, this region may not be able to convince significant numbers of foreign investors to take the plunge into their economies without establishing strong capital markets and ensuring the convertibility of currencies. Taking the plunge into a market economy, Mr. Lazier, you just returned from Eastern Europe. What are some of the problems with diving right in when you talk about it in a global context?
Well, Central and Eastern Europe, rightly or wrongly, are certainly looking toward the rest of the world for help, both in terms of capital and investment, and also in terms of trade opportunities. But in order for capitalists to be willing to invest in these countries, they have to create a climate that's favorable to business there. There are a number of key factors that people talk about in terms of the creation of that climate, perhaps the most important of which is establishing an exchange rate that reflects the true values of the various currencies. Distorted exchange rates create trade imbalances, and most economists accept that in the long run cannot be supported. Poland has probably done the most in this respect, and they have essentially a market exchange rate. Ironically, the big problem there seems to be a balance of payments surplus rather than a balance of payments deficit. Some people within the Eastern and Central European countries are concerned that a surplus means that cheap food and other raw materials will flee the countries to the West and leave the local citizens impoverished. So one of the issues that has to be addressed is this issue of exchange rates. Now, part of that may result from having fixed exchange rates as most of these countries have actually set up right now. One of the major advantages to having free trade, already mentioned by Milton Friedman earlier, is that foreign goods and foreign enterprises can provide competition with the local monopolies, and by doing so can remove some of the distortions that would otherwise be inherent in the economy. Also, methods have been suggested at this conference for dealing with some of the natural tendencies of governments to print too much money. That's a big problem that all governments face. It'll certainly be a problem in Central and Eastern Europe, and perhaps in the next few minutes we can talk about some of those issues.
Okay, well, here to help us sort through some of the concerns surrounding financial markets and currency convertibility are Mr. Peter Bod, Hungarian Minister of Industry, and Mr. Vladimir Dloi, Federal Minister of the Economy of Czechoslovakia. Mr. Bod played a major role in drafting the Hungarian Democratic Forum Party statement on economic policy. He was Department Chief of the National Planning Office's Economic Policy Institute and served as an expert at the United Nations on economic issues relating to the Third World. Mr. Dloi is also an economist. He was at the Czechoslovakian Academy of Science before assuming his present position in the cabinet of the first freely elected Czechoslovakian government. Mr. Dloi's ministry is responsible for economic policy and planning in Czechoslovakia. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Mr. Bod, Hungary has been one of the more successful countries in making a transition into a new economy. What steps were taken and what steps continue to be taken to ensure good relations with other countries and foreign investment?
Well, the legacy we inherit is a mixed one, because we have had 2 decades of economic reforms, and they were not in vain. So they created a middle class and the financial superstructure institutions. But we also inherited a huge debt. So this is the first thing I would emphasize. We have to do some correction in the macroeconomic policy. Without a sane macroeconomic environment, there would be no foreign investor coming to Hungary, and the home investors would not invest unless they feel that the macroeconomic policy is stable, sane, and rational. We also had to increase prices. I just heard that made the governments very unpopular in other countries. Our price system was not as bad as in other East European nations, but the first job I had to face was to increase the energy prices at the height of the Gulf crisis, which made the Hungarian newly elected government extremely unpopular. Taxi drivers took to the street and blocked the bridges because of the 60% gasoline price increase. But this is a job that you have to do to introduce world prices into your economy, even that makes you unpopular. And we inherited from the previous, the communist government, an agreement with the IMF. I don't know how our panelists think about the role of IMF in the world, but since we inherited an agreement, we thought we should keep it. Pacta sunt servanda. You have to, meet your obligations, and this is why we reduced budgetary deficit and increased some prices where we had to, and continued the strict economic policies. So in the end, finally, I'm happy to report, and Mr. Shultz just mentioned that big names also appeared in the Hungarian economy. The General Electric, the General Motors, the Ford Motor Corporation, the United Technologies, just to name a few of the American companies or Japanese. And 1/3 of the joint ventures that have been created in the East, so-called East Bloc, 1/3 of them were taken in Hungary, which indicates that we have some, some privilege in some sense because of the good start and the longer history of economic reforms.
Mr. Dloi, what about Czechoslovakia? After World War II, your country was one of the richest. And what are you doing now to further trade and foreign capital to regain that status?
Well, first of all, I would like to correct you a little bit as concerns my position, because facing our distinguished American colleagues of this caliber, I cannot leave on my shoulders that I am the planning minister anymore. In the first post-communist government, I was nominated to be the chairman of the planning commission, but after 6 months, I successfully abolished it. So I was the last, I was the last planning minister of my country, and for the moment, I'm the minister of economics, where we juxtaposed all these branch ministries we used to have for metallurgy, for energy, for machinery, and for God knows what. And, well, but now coming to the question, well, I think that the convertibility of the currency is a crucial issue in your question. What do we do for attracting the foreign investors? And let me stop here for a while. We did what all our countries did, or some of our countries now intend to do, that we declared the currency to be convertible, and we introduced a fixed exchange rate being pegged to some basket of currencies, so basically the major Western currencies. And this we done in concordance with the agreements with IMF. We had obviously to devaluate several times just to bring more or less the market exchange rate where the demand equals supply. And the demand from our newly liberalized domestic firms is quite high indeed. We needed some standby arrangements to support this convertibility policy. And we considered it and we tried to sell it to the public as one of the pillars of the economic reform we would like to introduce in the country. It obviously has a lot of negative consequences, political ones. You should explain to the people why you must devaluate, why you must have such a large difference between the purchasing power parities, which everybody implicitly knows what is it, because now people can freely travel to West Germany. They understand how much is the bread there and how much is the bread in Czechoslovakia, and the exchange rate, which so much undervalues the domestic currency. It brings a lot of inflationary pressures to the country, and it has additional problems because, well, you have an inflationary pressure. You must increase your interest rate just to achieve to some realistic level. Then you have a very, very expensive credits. The firms are asking why these interest rates are, to have them real, are so high, and they look for the Western banks where they are much lower. So there is a lot of problems of this kind. But let me say that we believe that this was a necessary step. By fixed exchange rate, we needed some anchor in the situation when everything got moved and everything got changed. Yesterday we had a very nice discussion with Professor Friedman on this issue when he introduced some ingenious other view on it. I would personally opt the approach which should lead to much more liberalization. Probably starting from the exchange rate to approach some floating, be it a dirty floating with some ideal clean floating, which I don't believe we will be able to achieve. But, well, this should be the basic approach. As concerns the financial markets, I will not discuss them in particular details because the time doesn't allow us. Just only let me tell you one thing. I even see here the privatization as being the crucial issue. Because, well, actually, what we are speaking when we have in mind the financial market, we actually speak about the allocation of the free resources to the new subject, obviously the private subject, being either domestic or foreign. And that's the privatization, again, the major vehicle. Because privatization I see as a vehicle of assignment of property rights, which then obviously can increase the domestic savings and you need to create the appropriate investment environment in your economy. And yesterday Milton Friedman asked me, what do I mean by investment environment or encouraging the investment environment? Well, liberalized, liberalized, and liberalized. That's the basic issue.
How do you feel about when you hear that liberalize is the answer?
Oh, it is the answer, but I would use not the word liberalize, but privatize. I always say there are three keys to successful development: privatize, privatize, privatize. Okay. But I want to make
the most important.
the second one. But I want to make a very different kind of a comment because I think it's very important, and not to confuse, two kinds of things about higher prices. Mr. Bod said quite properly you had to raise the prices for meat or whatnot. And I was reminded of a story of Mrs. Jones who goes to the butcher and she buys some lamb chops at, let's see, I don't know what the price is now, this price is taken out of the air, $1.79, let's say, a pound. And she says to him, you know, I don't understand why you charge $1.79. The butcher across the street has it advertised in the window for $1.59. And he says, why don't you go over there and buy it? And she says, oh, he doesn't have any. Now, which price is higher? So when you speak of higher prices, you have to distinguish sharply two things. Those cases in which the nominal prices are artificial prices people have to stand in line to get what's involved because the demand is greater than the supply. And you raise prices in order to get the supply equal to the demand, a particular price. That's really a lowering of prices. It's not a raising of prices, because now you have a more efficient mechanism. People don't have to waste all their time in line. That's to be distinguished sharply from the real curse of so many of these countries, which is general inflation, which is not produced by the fact that prices have been artificial, but is always produced by the same thing, the printing of too much money. And the printing of too much money occurs because government in these countries spends more than it takes in taxes. And it's very tempting for governments to try to eliminate that discrepancy by raising taxes. We in the United States know that very well. And it's very hard to move in the other direction, which is a right direction. And George pointed that out with respect to bases. But from the point of view of your future, the right direction is to get that and get control of that by lowering spending, not by raising taxes. And now, a country can have development with inflation. It'll do better if it doesn't have inflation. But there are notable cases of countries that have had substantial inflation and yet have developed very rapidly. You cannot do that, however, if you insist on having a fixed exchange rate. And I think the problem of how you fix the exchange rate of currency convertibility is one of the trickiest problems that there is. Everybody says, well, we want to have a markedly appropriate or realistic valuation of the exchange rate. But you're in a situation in which circumstances are changing very rapidly, you hope, in which the mix of products is changing, in which prices are changing. Who knows what is the right exchange rate? And what you do when you peg an exchange rate and really adopt every mechanism to hold it there, you make the whole rest of the system adjust to that. That would be fine if the number you picked happened to be by accident somewhere close to right. But it isn't always fine. Here's the case of Poland has been cited. I think what Poland did was a great mistake. Poland, in order to peg the exchange rate, it had to undervalue it. Every one of these do have to undervalue it. The result of that was Poland had a large foreign exchange surplus. That's crazy. Should Poland be lending money to the advanced countries? That's what it does when it has a large foreign exchange surplus. It's exporting more than it's importing, and Poland is a poor country. It needs its exports at home. It shouldn't be sending exports out. The world is insane, I may say, in many ways. The rich countries of this world are borrowing money from the poor countries. If that makes sense, it's hard for me to see how. But whatever may be true in the rest of the world, so far as countries like yours are concerned, you have no business generating balance of payment surpluses. What you want to do is to have an even balance of payments trade, roughly, and if anything, you want to generate deficits by having foreign investment. So that the question of currency convertibility, you do want a convertible currency, but I think that it will almost always prove impossible to set a fixed price on that convertible and keep it at that price. And that the only feasible way to have currency convertible is by allowing the exchange rate to be a free market price and to float from day to day.
I see Mr. Dlowy shaking his head there. I knew you wanted to respond to this.
Well, I do not dare to disagree, certainly.
The free country.
No. Well, yeah, but I obviously agree. Well, but I think we should distinguish between the final goal and the transition period, in spite of the fact that I remember yesterday's words of Professor Stigler, which I will certainly bring home to say that what is it, a transition, that it is an interval between two transitions, if I understood you well. So even that we can interpret it in this way. But yes, we are in some transitional period. First, how do we see the inflation in our countries? After having liberalized bulk of our price system at the beginning of this year, we had a 25% in January, we had 8.8 in February and 6.3 in March, so we have stabilized. Was that the inflation, or was it just the adjustment of prices after having liberalized them? This is the first question. Then the second question, you say that inflation is basically the consequence of the government printing the money. But the issue in Czechoslovakia, and I'm sure at least in Hungary and Poland, is that we indeed have already minimized the expenditure side of our budget, really cutting down all the subsidies, only keeping those who are necessarily from the political feasibility of the process. Just you need at least to finance something, otherwise you would have a political blow-up. From this point of view, you see the taxes as they are set, and they are set quite high in our country, 55% on profit of the enterprise. This is very high indeed. But this parameter is given by the minimal expenditure side of the budget. So this is another point. And the third point, then it runs in the chain of logic to the fixed or floating exchange rate, and there I expressed my view. I agree with you fully.
You're becoming a politician too soon. In talking about minimum level of expenditures, we've heard that in this country, haven't we?
Yeah, but I was an academician. I hope I will be again. Unfortunately, I must face the political issues for the moment.
What about, are Central and Eastern European industries, do you think they're misfocused and not making the most of their natural resources?
Well, we inherited a structure in which the heavy chemicals, heavy machinery, mining dominated the structure, and when you enter the world, you know, it's very hard to sell these products, especially if there's a competition from the NIC countries. So when we modernize the economy, we have to shift from the low value added to high value added activities, to service sector, and also to tourism, to mention a branch which also belongs to me, and I guess belongs to you at home, to my portfolio. And this is where we can invite foreign capital. It's very hard to find somebody that would take over Nova Huta. We just referred to it, but you know, a well-functioning pharmaceutical company or a traveling agency is for sale, and people will come and buy it. So this is part of the whole restructuring in the newly democratizing countries, and an obvious link to the West. But I have to make a mention of the achievements all these 6 countries have produced recently. The collapse of the CMEA, the Comecon, the shrinking of the Russian market, threatened with a collapse of the East European nations. And strange enough, but at least in Hungary, the collapse or shrinking of the Russian export was more or less compensated by the increase of a hard currency export. At least in 1990, we produced a very good shift. And my personal impression was, because that was the time when we formed the new government, and I reorganized my ministry, reduced the size to half, because there is, if there's a budget, you can also have the budget. I totally agree with you. And we couldn't answer the telephones. You know, everybody moved the rooms. And the lobbyists could not talk to us. Industrialists could not talk to the minister because I had no phone. And in final despair, and the economy, because in final despair, they began to work. And they achieved $1 billion trade surplus, which is an achievement. I don't totally agree with you, Professor, because we have a huge debt, so to lessen the debt is a goal. So this brings some music to your ears, because if there's a break in government, the economy can still function quite well.
Well, you
I'd like to make a comment on this point of resources. And it has always seemed to me, as you look around the world and look in our own country, that the most important resource that anyone has is its people. And their quality, their energy, the level of education they've attained, their abilities are the key thing. And in thinking about the prospects of the countries of Central Europe, it seems to me one of the most important things to focus on is that there they have people of high quality who have, in the past, under different circumstances, been very productive. They have good literacy rates. They have educational aspirations. And basically, underneath it all, the concentration on that is going to be the key.
You know, what George says brings out something that I think is very important. people tend to attribute differences in level of living to all sorts of things, to different cultures, different languages, different habits. But evidence is overwhelming that one thing above all determines it, and that is the economic institutions. And the most dramatic example I can think of that is your country, Czechoslovakia. 1938, one of the richest countries in the world, a level of living that was comparable to countries like Britain, France, the United States, and so on. 50 years later, one of the poorest countries in the world. Same country, same people, same resources. It's an enormously powerful example of the effect which the wrong institutions can have. Because what produced that? Communism, central collective planning. And on the other side, what the right institutions can produce is a case of the four tigers in Eastern Europe. Here you have China, poor, miserable, Hong Kong, poor, miserable people coming over to Hong Kong from China. Population multiplying tenfold in the course of 40 years. No resources except a great harbor. The most rapid rate of growth in per capita consumption in Eastern Europe. What produced it? Nothing but institutions. The fact that their benevolent dictator, a colonial officer from England, enforced a regime of free trade, no tariffs, no restraints, free economy, and low taxes. Nothing else produced it.
Can I comment on it?
Yes, we have a few minutes left here.
Well, first, let's look realistically at Czechoslovakia, both in 37 and now. In 37, if I remember my research, which I have done some 3-4 years ago, we were on the level of 210 old good American dollars per capita of GDP. At that time, United States were somewhere about 500, and the countries like France, 250, 260. Czechoslovakia was not only the rich Bohemian countries, but also the Slovakia and Subcarpathian Ukraine, or how do you call it in English, which made it on average much lower. And in 85, we, if you use as a conversion factor the purchasing power parity, we were on some level between $5,000 to $7,000 dollars per capita of GDP. It's a dirty trick with PPP, obviously, but you can find that this is still a country with much higher standard of living than is its economic performance. And the second point, the Southeast Asia, but when the Koreans come to me, I had just the president of Samsung recently. He tried to teach me that I shouldn't be so liberal, that I should keep some government controls. And he was telling me how they did in Korea. So in the historical perspective, it was not so single-minded. But obviously, as a tendency, you are perfectly right.
Well, now I want to interrupt here so that we can take a call from Vermont, I believe. A caller with a question. Please go ahead.
If these countries had a freely floating exchange rate, would they have the political will to tolerate layoffs in their exporting industries as their exchange rates rise?
Who would like to tackle that? Mr. Bod?
We have to tolerate layoffs, and while I'm in office, the unemployment has increased by a factor of 4. I'm not too happy with it, but this is, I guess, unavoidable. And the general public understands that you have to do that. What goes easily is to close factories. What makes more headaches, causes more headaches, to find the right type of new ventures. But fortunately, without any planning or state support, the number of entrepreneurs have increased by a factor of 3 last year in Hungary. And we have good chances of becoming a Central European center, commercial and banking center, because mostly new ventures were born in the field of the soft industries, but they generate profits. So I don't mind if it's not mining or steel, but banks or financial services. But that raises the problem of retraining, because the miner that loses his job cannot be so easily used as a nurse, where we have a shortage. So it will take some years until the social structure will adapt to it, and meanwhile we have to live together with unemployment.
Mr. Dlouhy, want to add something to
Yes,
that?
well, I think that's quite clear what Mr. Bott said. Yes, we must be prepared on laying off the people anyway, disregarding the problem with the exchange rate. And it happens. We had an increase, I think, 3 times since the January 1st in unemployment. So the problem is there, and we must be politically able to face it. As concerns the exchange rate as such, maybe we are too soon after the beginning of our Czechoslovak economic reform, or I'm too optimistic. But for the moment, we do not feel a pressure for further devaluation. I don't want again to be optimistic, but we stabilized the exchange rate. It's that bad fixed exchange rate. But even if we went to some type of a floating, maybe immediately we wouldn't face such a problem. God knows how it's going to be in a year time.
I believe we have time for another question from a caller. Could you go ahead? I'm afraid we lost that caller right now, but we have been getting calls throughout the particular conference, and I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to all of them because our time is running out. As in all good things, this time has arrived, and today's discussion has been rich in both presenting the challenges facing Central and Eastern European countries and offering some suggestions for addressing them. Now I'm going to call on Mr. Shultz for the daunting task of kind of summarizing what we've been discussing here for the last 2 hours, and some suggestions for future directions in economic transition.
Well, first of all, I think it's interesting that you started by giving your telephone number and your fax number. And that's a symbol of how interconnected things are around the world now. And everybody has a fax, and communication is everywhere. And it's one of the things that keeps connecting the world with each other and letting people know anywhere what's going on elsewhere and be able to make comparisons. We started out with the topic of the relationship of political and economic developments. And although we went to the questions of privatization and pricing and then financial arrangements and exchange rates, this question of political economic interplay existed throughout. And I think that if we started out debating it, whether there was that essential relationship, the debate is over, and there is. And by and large, it seems to me, 2 things, at least as I would think of it, emerge from the discussion. One, that you have a kind of instability set up when you have open and free and democratic political institutions, and the lack of such on the economic side, or vice versa. And there is a tendency for them to want to go together. And at least as I see it, the force, particularly now, but perhaps always, has been for them to move in the direction of more open and free market and democratic institutions. It also, I think, came through as we discussed various subjects like pricing and how rapidly you change your price structure and try to find your way to world market prices, that quick is better than slow, that it's better to get on the basis of what will work as quickly as you can and take the dislocations that maybe arise from that as in one lump. And I would put this also in the category as a guide for persons setting policies, to get out in front of you all the time a compass and put the weather vane behind you, because it's the compass that really is going to get you where you want to go. And while sometimes you have to tack and cut and fit a little bit with the weather vane, if you start steering by it, you'll really go completely off. We discussed the subject of privatization at some length, and it was surrounded by the notion of where are the local resources to buy things if we privatize, on the one hand, and on the other with the notion that if these resources are essentially state-owned at the beginning, they're owned by the people, and therefore, in a sense, there are the resources, they belong to the people, and can't you devise some way to make a transfer relatively quickly so that you obey Milton Friedman's 3 laws: privatize, privatize, privatize. And in a sense, it was brought out, and George made this point particularly, that the key is not so much to worry about how you're going to divide this pie that exists now, but how you're going to get onto a system that will allow you to grow and enlarge the pie, and therefore everybody is able to share in something that's more bountiful. I think also the point was made, and it was, I think, brushed aside perhaps a little too quickly from what I've seen by our friends from Central Europe, that it's important that there not be barriers to new enterprises, to new entries into industries that may have been dominated by a state monopoly. And there are all sorts of subtle ways in which new ventures can be discouraged, and those need to be examined very carefully, because this is a great source of energy, and certainly if you look at the recent economic history, or maybe the economic history of the United States, it's new ventures, firms that were originally small, but added a vitality and competitive spirit that have done so much for us. On the subject of investment and financial arrangements, exchange rates, I think our Mr. Bod from Hungary made the point very strongly that in explaining Hungary's success, that investment is attracted to a situation that has potential, and a situation where there are a set of rules that you can count on, and they're not going to be changed tomorrow, and that'll be very important to any potential investor. I would say, in terms of the debate, the question of fixed versus a floating exchange rate, you didn't agree with each other. As the former Secretary of the Treasury in the United States that really moved us on to a floating exchange rate system, you know what side of the argument I'm on. But I do think that underneath it all, you want stable exchange rates, but they have to emerge from an underlying stable situation. And if they do, then you have what you want. If you can't get a stable underlying situation, the fixed exchange rate is going to have to be changed. And that's about where I would come out on that. I think Milton and I had what might be thought of as a little bit of a disagreement. I emphasized the importance of people and what they can do. And Milton seemed to contradict me by saying what's important is the system, and look how different the output is in the same country with basically, you'll say, the same people when you change the system. I agree with him, but I think you agree with me that if you look at the situation in Central Europe and the changes in the system that are taking place, and ask yourself about the prospects, then you have to look, I think, not so much at how much oil or coal or whatever you have, but rather how much talent you have and how educable it is, and what the people are going to bring to the party. And at least from what I can see, they're going to bring a lot.
It's a perfect note upon which to end this conference. Thank you, Mr. Shultz. It has been my pleasure to moderate this session with the assistance of Mr. Lazier. And now on behalf of the Hoover Institution, I want to thank all of our distinguished panelists here today, our honored studio audience as well, and our valued audience across North America for making this video conference a very special event indeed. Now, to those of you in this room and at distant sites, let me invite you to continue your dialogue with one another and with our experts here, because for the next half hour, our panelists have agreed to continue taking questions by phone and from these different remote sites and in person here at the Stauffer Auditorium. But this concludes our video portion of the teleconference. Thank you for joining us and for helping to make this video conference a stimulating contribution to our understanding of the issues confronting Central and Eastern Europe and some of the ways that their challenges can be successfully solved. Thank you and goodbye.